Good afternoon. I'm Daalder, President of Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and thank you for joining us today, including everyone who's tuning in from around the world on YouTube, and a special thanks to those people who are here with us in our studio today in Chicago for this important event this afternoon, an on-the-record program with Senator Joni Ernst on emerging threats to national defense. For those of you at home, we welcome you to submit your questions to today's conversation at ccga.live. For those who are in the studio, you may ask your question live from the center microphone when we transition to Q&A in about 30 minutes' time. Just as a reminder, the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan organization. The views, therefore, expressed on our platform are from those who express the views and cannot be attributed to the Council. It's now my great honor to introduce Senator Joni Ernst, a U.S. Senator from our neighboring state in Iowa. She spent her career in national service, served for 23 years as a military officer, was elected as the first woman to serve a federal elected office from the state of Iowa, and equally impressive, the first female combat veteran to serve in the U.S. Senate. Today, she serves on 4 different committees: the Armed Services Committee, Agriculture, Nutrition and Forestry, Environmental and Public Works, and Small Business and Entrepreneurship. We're delighted to have you here with us today, and we're so looking forward to our conversation. Thank you for joining us.
No, thank you, Ivo, and of course to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I want to congratulate you on your 100th anniversary. I understand that you have been engaging for a century now on the global stage. And the way I understand, your founders determined that we really needed to promote the United States engagement in various platforms, but engaging on the world stage. And that is so important to me, and I'm glad to be here today. We can see just many examples around the world today why it's so important that the United States exhibit leadership when it comes to foreign affairs, whether it's assisting with our military at times when we absolutely have to. But it is very important that we are that shining light. There are so many that turn to us in times of need, and it's important that we maintain that relationship with our friends and allies around the world. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and to share some thoughts and answer questions, and I think we're going to have a really great conversation. So again, thank you very much. I appreciate being here.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks. We really appreciate you taking the time to come to Chicago, not too far from Iowa, but still, it's kind of on the way. Maybe you'll drive away from here on your motorbike back home. Or not, but it's great to have you.
Thank you.
All seriousness, the world's got some serious issues. Let's talk about Ukraine. You have the flag of the U.S. and Ukraine on your lapel, an important relationship. But you've known Ukraine. You were there first as a college student, as I understand, and spoken publicly about your personal connections to the country. What can you tell about your experience in the country and why this has become such a special period for us to really stand with the Ukrainian people?
And yes, Ivo, I have had a long time relationship with the wonderful people in Ukraine for a very long time now. My relationship started when I was a young woman at Iowa State University, and we have one shirt from Iowa State here in the audience today. But it wasn't an Iowa State program, but it was between my semesters when I was a freshman and sophomore. I was selected as one of 18 Iowa students to attend an agricultural exchange in Ukraine. That was 1989. And those of you, I see a few of you that have gray hair in the audience, you will remember that in 1989, Ukraine was part of the former Soviet Union. So the Iowa students, we loaded up on an airplane, first time I'd ever been on an airplane as a 19-year-old woman, and my first trip in an airplane took me into the Soviet Union. And from Moscow, we went into Ukraine, and I lived with a family on a collective farm over several weeks during that summer. And we were there part of an agricultural exchange. We were talking with those that were hosting us about Iowa agriculture practices, how our family farms worked, and of course, we were working on that collective farm with the Ukrainians. And it struck me because when I went there, the family I stayed with, they did not have a tractor. The collective was still using horses and wagons to farm. We were hand-picking vegetables during the summer, and my family did not have running water. They didn't have a telephone. They didn't have a refrigerator, and it's 1989. And the first evening that we were able to get together as a community at their community center, a number of the Ukrainians had gathered and the Iowa students got together. And what do you suppose that first question they asked us was? It was not about agriculture. They asked us what it was like to be an American, and they asked us what it was like to be free. And from that point in history, I recognized just the incredible exceptionalism of our country and our democratic republic, and how we have elected people that will represent their constituencies. The opportunities and freedoms that were granted us from the United States is not something that my Ukrainian sister experienced. And it was just a few years after that they did fall apart from the Soviet Union. Ukraine found its independence, and they have been struggling with their democracy ever since. But from that point moving forward, I understood in 1989 just how incredible freedom is, and that there are so many other nations around the globe that aspire to be like the United States of America. And I was grateful when they had a taste of that independence. But with Russia invading Ukraine now, I see this as a very difficult time in our history, because they want to be free in Ukraine. They do not want to be absorbed by Russia. And they are fighting like heck to maintain their freedoms and independence. So yes, I have very personal connections to Ukraine and what they're striving for. My sister and I, Ukrainian sister and I, are still in contact today. You know, again, the modern miracle of technology. We are corresponding back and forth every single day over the internet. And what they are going through it's horrible. It is really horrible.
Where is she?
So she is located now, she no longer lives on the collective. She is in the area known as Mykolaiv. Mm-hmm. She's in a small village near Mykolaiv, and they have been heavily shelled by the Russians. The Russians are lobbing in missiles from Crimea and from the Black Sea. She is a school teacher, and they have converted their schoolhouse into a refugee center. And she told me just yesterday, so far they have and she lives in a tiny village outside of Mykolaiv. In that tiny village, they have 115 families that have fled out of the occupied area of Russia. There are many more, she said, in the district. But they are scrambling to gather up food supplies for those refugees and provide them the hygiene items necessary. But it's very difficult times. She did move her daughter to Poland and has gone back in to help with the refugee situation. She feels she is needed in Ukraine. She didn't want to leave her husband, who is still in Ukraine. Obviously, the men are required to stay. But it's a very difficult situation, and one that, frankly, I think the United States was not adequately prepared to engage in this situation, because Russia has talked about invading Ukraine for a very long time, and I think everybody saw it as bluster. But we need to take these threats seriously, and we need to engage, whether it's through diplomacy, whether it's through building their military might. I am reluctant to engage American soldiers with Russian soldiers, but there are ways we can help assist Ukraine in their time of need.
So talk a little bit about that, because we've all seen these horrendous pictures of how much is destroyed in Ukraine because of the Russian advance. We've also seen incredible pictures of heroism. You've just talked about your Ukrainian sister who could have left the country and decided that she needed to be there for her people. We've seen a nation that I think is now at 97% behind their own president, which is, any president would like that approval rating.
Oh,
Even
gosh,
half of
yes.
that, right?
Absolutely.
Would be nice. But we're doing a lot. There's a vote coming up in the Senate next week, I believe, on a nearly $40 billion aid package. Is that enough, or is there other things we need to do?
This is what they are asking for now. And the package, as we have been able to go through it, a lot of it is to backfill our own resources here in the United States. Part of it will then go on to Ukraine in the form of lethal aid, various munitions and platforms necessary for them to not only defend their country, but we want to expel the Russians out of Ukraine. So we'll try and outfit them as best we can for that goal. But a large portion of it as well is humanitarian aid. And not all of the humanitarian aid will be destined for Ukraine, but for other affected nations. We, just like Iowa, just like Illinois, we are large commodity producing states when it comes to agriculture and food. Wheat is predominant in Ukraine, as well as corn, other grains. A lot of that goes to the Middle East and to African nations. And those nations are now extremely vulnerable to food insecurity. We know that starving nations oftentimes produce those that will gravitate towards terrorist organizations, and that in turn then destabilizes not only those nations and those regions, but it also affects our national security right here at home.
You mentioned the food crisis. It's an important part of what's happening. Silos are full in Ukraine. The grain can't get out. Apparently, the harvest is looking pretty good in Ukraine, despite everything that's happening. But once it's harvested, if the silos are full, can't be put in there. And as a result, so many people around the world are not getting access to food. You've introduced a bill to accelerate the ability for us to give food aid, I believe, where it's the U.S. flag ships can need to carry a certain amount. Cargo preference. Talk a little bit about how that would help this situation. And then also, is there a way we can get this food out of Ukraine? Is there a way that we might be able to help shipping in and out of Odessa, where the ports ship there? It's of course blocked by the Russians, but it's Ukrainian territory. It's international waters, or doing it through rail and trucks to accelerate this, because it's pretty critical, not just for Ukraine as an income, but for the world. As we think about how we're going to feed the hungry people.
Absolutely. I thank you, Ivo, for pointing that out. I do have a bill. It is a bipartisan bill with Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. We have partnered together to waive what we call cargo preference. So currently, when we are delivering U.S. food aid within Title II, and we won't go into all that, but the basic premise is that when the United States is providing food aid to other nations, when we are delivering that food aid, 50% of the cargo vessels must be U.S. flagged. And 75% of those serving on those ships must be United States citizens. So we're trying, through that measure, they were trying to give U.S. vessels preference because it's aid coming from the United States. But the situation literally on the sea right now is we only have, as the United States, we only have 4 cargo vessels that meet the standard that's set by that particular code. 4. And those 4 ships are already engaged in other private contracts elsewhere. So they're not available to move U.S. food aid. We have over 12,000 ships globally that would meet the criteria, but we can't use them because we don't have the U.S. vessels. So what we're trying to do through this measure is waive that requirement and contract with whatever ships are available now to move that food aid out. It becomes very hard to send commodities from the United States if we have no way to get the commodities to Europe. So we have to engage and do this quickly so that we can move aid. Part of the other point that you made was actually what grain is in Ukraine. They have harvested in the past, and part of those harvests are still in the silos, which they had anticipated they would be able to distribute to other nations that they have contracts with. That's not happening because the Black Sea right now, which is where they can export those goods, the port of Odessa, all of that is blockaded right now by Russian vessels. So they don't have the ability to move that grain out by sea. And the infrastructure in Ukraine has been targeted by Russians. Their rail system, a number of bridges in Ukraine, all of that has been targeted by Russians. And in some case, Ukrainians have actually had to blow bridges or prevent Russians from advancing. So right now, moving any level of goods through the country has been extremely difficult. So a solution is to work to find a way to transport those goods to neighboring countries by land bridge rather than by sea, but that's very slow. And it won't move in time, really, to be able to distribute the Ukrainian commodities to starving nations. So we've had a lengthy discussion with David Beasley. He's the ambassador to the United Nations World Food Program. We had a very lengthy discussion with him just a couple of days ago in my office, and he ran through a number of ways that they might be able to assist in moving that food. But one of his key phrases now, and I hate it, is we are now taking food from the hungry to provide to the starving. And it's a difficult situation when Ukraine normally is such a wealth of resources and a breadbasket to so many of those countries.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And David Beasley, by the way, who's just done tremendous work as the head of the World Food Program, and we at the Council have two former heads of the World Food Program as our distinguished fellows. So we're deeply appreciative of all the work that the WFP does, but it's a really tough situation. 275 million people near starvation, I think, is the latest calculation, and that too is part of the Russian war effort. It's not just what's happening in Ukraine. Let me switch gears because we wanted to talk about emerging technologies, and you're, of course, a member on the Armed Services Committee. I wonder what are some of the emerging security threats that you worry most about and that we may be least prepared to deal with?
Through the 2018 National Defense Strategy, we really shifted to, I would almost call them more re-emerging threats. But those would be those global competitors like China and Russia, Iran, North Korea. Those are the ones that we typically think about. But with emerging threats, and we have witnessed this even after the attack on 9/11, those terrorist groups that continue to evolve in places that we wouldn't necessarily think of. You know, we think about 9/11 and the terrorist threat that came out of the Middle East and targeted the United States, but we see those groups evolving and moving, establishing around the globe, in Yemen and other countries in Africa. We see them emerging in the Philippines. We see them emerging in South America. And these are areas that we typically, as a United States, have not really paid a lot of attention to. So we really do have to keep our eye not only on those near-peer competitors, the big Chinas and Russias. I would say China is probably the largest pacing threat we have, but then also those small elements that can easily move around the globe with very little notice that can do a great deal of harm, just as we saw in 9/11.
And do you think we're well prepared enough for addressing these challenges, both on the military side and maybe on the intelligence and national side?
I think that we can do much better. Let me put a positive spin on it. I think we can do better. But I would say from other security experts, whether it is the FBI Director Reyes, whether it is our Special Operations Commander, General Rich Clark, I think there are a number of folks that closely monitor these terrorist organizations around the globe that would tell you we are not properly postured to identify and counter some of these terrorist threats. That is a concern. So we do have to do more moving into the future to modernize our technologies. Having a minimal presence around the globe, I think, is extremely important. You all know I was very, very disappointed when we had the pullout in Afghanistan. We had a minimum number of troops there. We had the human intelligence capabilities in Afghanistan to monitor some of these terrorist organizations. And now we have no American presence on the ground in Afghanistan. And the overhead technologies that we have of monitoring from the sky through satellite, through drone technology, it is very limited in scope in what we can do and the types of intelligence we can gather. So our top security and intelligence analysts have stated that they do believe that these terrorist organizations are reconstituting in Afghanistan. They are making their presence grow in other regions as well. So we can do much, much better than we are currently as a nation.
I want to remind folks who are watching us online that you can submit your questions by going to your browser and typing in ccga.live, ask a question there, vote on a question that's already there, and we're going to get to questions here in the room as well in a few short minutes. You're a veteran. You've served in the military for well over 2 decades. One study has recently come out and said that only about 23% of our teens are now eligible to serve in the military. The other 75+% not able for physical reasons or education reasons or because of criminal offenses. How are we going to sustain a all-volunteer force, which is what we have, and a remarkable all-volunteer force for sure, at a time that we all agree the military is not unlikely to get any smaller. It probably needs to get bigger, particularly with the new serious threat in Europe and the remaining threat in China, and then the emerging security challenges you talked about. How worried, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, as a veteran, are you that we may not have enough people to fill the ranks?
I am extremely worried about this, Ivo, very worried. And the statistics are alarming. And if we look at the reason behind those statistics, we recognize that not just as a federal government, because federal government can't solve all of these issues on its own, but at the state level, the local level, even within our schools, we need to do a better job of developing our young people. So you mentioned some of the reasons behind those statistics, and one of the reasons is that young people, if they have engaged in criminal activities, there are some things that we simply cannot allow in our United States military. I've even, as a battalion commander, had the example, a young man that was, being recruited into the National Guard. He did have a pretty serious offense as a juvenile, and one that our military will not bend on, which is a good thing. After I'd reviewed the recruiting file, and I said, absolutely not. I'm not going to provide a waiver for this behavior when we're trying to fight against it in the military. So there are criminal behaviors out there. There is drug usage. out there. There are mental health issues out there. The fact that many of our young men and women can't pass basic fitness tests to get, so obesity is an issue, the level of fitness is an issue. And we still, even today, have students, and it's been exacerbated by COVID, with schools not being in full time. Many of them can't pass what we call the ASVAB test, just basic level education requirements to get into our United States military. So these are all issues that we really need to tackle collectively. I am very, very concerned about recruitment for the United States military. My daughter, I'm going to brag for just a moment.
Do.
So my daughter, in a week from tomorrow, will be commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. And, I'm really thankful for those of that generation that are stepping forward to serve our phenomenal country and promoting the freedoms and opportunities that exist here in the United States. So there are still those that will choose to serve. We want to enable more to choose to serve, but we can't bend our standards. We can't bring the standards down because we know that that will allow for many more difficulties. We need a physically fit and intelligent military to engage in the types of challenges that we see globally today.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your daughter.
Thank you. I'm so excited.
It's very exciting. Yeah. Graduating is one thing. Being commissioned is fantastic. So you're right to be proud. One of the questions that coming through online is, in fact, how can we encourage, or put it this way, what advice would you have, not just for your daughter, but people like her, about young people in particular, how to get in public service, why this is important that they think about doing this, and how do you encourage more people to serve, not just in the military, because there's so much other things that we need to do in public service.
Absolutely. And I am always so thrilled when we have young people that are stepping forward and saying, I really want to engage. I want to be part of my community and find solutions for my community, for my state, for my nation. I love that. Whether it's military or other service, I believe that we all should serve in whatever our hearts are drawn to. So for my daughter, it is that form of service through the military to protect and to serve our great United States. For others, those young budding leaders, those that want to engage, I always encourage them to get active in their local community, whatever it happens to be. You can engage in city council activities. You can be on the board of supervisors. You can volunteer at your local hospital. You can volunteer at the library. You can serve as a Sunday school teacher. Whatever it is, engage in your community. Know your population. Provide service to them. To me, that's so important. I think volunteerism is one of the greatest forms of giving back to communities. And it does lead then to additional opportunities if they are seeking them in serving in a public role, whether it's an elected or an appointed capacity. I encourage that. So I'm always excited. There are days, this, Eva, there are days that we get very discouraged, serving in whatever capacity, certainly at the federal level. But all I have to do is look at young men and women in our high schools and in our universities and how they are so excited about their future and the opportunities out there. And, I know and understand that our country is going to be okay. There's some truly great budding leaders that are out there.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it is the future that that gives us all hope. I want to encourage anyone in the room, if you want to ask a question, there's a microphone over there. If you can step behind it, and then I'll make sure that you have an opportunity.
Don't be shy.
To do that. So don't be shy. But a lot of people online are not shy. By the way, a whole bunch of people are just typing in the questions here in the room. I know how that goes. So I'm going to question on which it's phrased in terms of the Republican Party. I actually think it's not just a Republican issue, but members of the Republican and Democratic Party, I would put it, are calling for a more isolationist foreign policy. We have it in both parties. You eloquently spoke at the outset about the importance of American engagement. In the context of the war in Ukraine, in the context of what we're finding in terms of the threats that we face, how do you make the case to your constituents in particular, and to your colleagues who are on both sides,
Right.
Who think we need to focus at home, we don't have time for the abroad? How do you make the case?
Right. And this is such a great point, because I actually do hear from Iowans, both sides of the aisle, that don't understand why we need to engage, whether it's Ukraine or globally, just globally in general. But in particular, when it comes to Ukraine, and it's such a good example today, because Russia will not stop at Ukraine. And they will not stop if they come in and they're allowed to occupy Donbass and then proclaim it as part of the Russian state. They will reconstitute, and they'll move a little bit further. We have other nations in Europe that feel under threat by Vladimir Putin. He will keep taking territory. And we have to remember that this is an authoritarian regime. And as we see those regimes expanding, we see democracies shrinking. That's just, you can't have both. So he will continue to move as far as he can. And without staying strong on the world stage and pushing back against that type of activity, we're folding. And we're saying, okay, Russia, it's okay for you to start occupying other countries in Europe. We're not going to engage. What does that signal then to China as well? It signals to China that it's okay for you to take Taiwan, and the United States will not engage. You can see this pattern just continuing to develop like dominoes, just one after the other, falling down around the globe if we don't engage in some manner. Now, all of it doesn't have to be by military might. There's a lot of diplomacy that goes behind this. There's sanctions. There's so many tools in the toolbox that we should be engaging in and using. But what does that mean to America? Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the stock market has dropped 3,000 points. It is affecting retirees and some of their savings in different types of vehicles. We have seen the price of fuel skyrocket because so much of that is coming out of Russia. The cost to Iowa and Illinois farmers right now when it comes to fertilizer. We have many more nations that are competing for fertilizer sources, since so much of that product in developing fertilizers comes out of Russia. It is impacting all of us. And with the food shortage that we talked about a little bit earlier, it destabilizes countries. We have another Arab Spring type situation on our hands. Terrorist organizations thrive when they can recruit from these areas that have very little food security. And in turn, whether it is those large global powers like Russia or China, or whether it's those smaller violent extremist organizations, they all pose a threat, a national security threat to the United States of America. And so everything matters, and our position in the globe matters. And I would much rather spend the dollars now. One, I would hope to prevent any sort of conflict by building up other nations, by supporting them, by sanctions, whatever it might be. Rather do that and hope that we don't engage in a military conflict. But in a time as this, focusing on Ukraine and supporting them, we hopefully will not have to engage Russia directly. So let's keep those nations strong. Let's in turn then strengthen our own national security. And it matters. It matters.
We have to put that statement on our website because it's a great argument for engagement in the world. I couldn't agree with you more. We do have a question from the room, and Avi Porat is with us.
I appreciate very much what you described so far, and especially the current aid that's going to Ukraine, etc. I'm trying to look a little forward. If this crisis takes not weeks, but months or a year or 2 years, how can Ukraine survive? And the other question is, what would Putin do if he decides right now not to go after Europe like we originally predicted and go somewhere else? How do we get ready if we decide to do something in the Middle East or take some more land in the North Pole? You know, if it starts to take actions in other parts of the world, A, what do you think will happen? Will it happen? Second, what can we do?
No, and thank you very much. That is a very good question. And short term for Ukraine, of course, in the upcoming months, we need to make sure that we are providing them everything to keep the Russians where they are, not to allow them to advance, but then also those types of offensive weapons, lethal weapon systems. The HIMARS would be particularly valuable right now because those missile systems can travel long range and hit the Russians. We need them out of Ukraine. That would be short term. Provide them the lethal assistance they need. Longer term, though, because you're talking years, this could go on for years. We don't want it to, but it could. So in that case, we need to make sure that we're ramping up the sanctions as quickly as possible. We have only sanctioned a few of the top banks in Russia, but most of those banks are state affiliated. And so you sanction the top 6, they're just going to move all those accounts into other state-owned banks in Russia. Let's not be naive about this, folks. They're going to do whatever they can to get around those sanctions. So sanctioning all of those banks and those entities would possibly be a great way to cut off what they're doing globally. Russian energy production, making sure that we're providing solutions for our partners and allies around the world and ramping up our own resources right here in the United States. So I'm an all of the above energy gal. Gas, petroleum products, I'm all about it. Ethanol from Iowa, I'm all about it. But any sort of energy, we need to make sure that we are producing homegrown energy. Wind, we're big proponents of wind in Iowa. If we can enable those technologies and those resources in Europe without tapping into Russian resources, we should do that. Let's cut off the flow that is going into Europe from Russia. And I think when we see that revenue stream decrease going into Russia and into the oligarchs' pockets, into Vladimir Putin's pockets, I think we're going to weaken them tremendously just through their economy. Maybe not militarily, but most certainly through their economy. So I think we have to think long-term strategy. Now, Putin moving into other areas, yeah, that could happen. Let's keep him engaged right now and let's weaken him so much he doesn't have the opportunity to move on. But if that should happen and he targets the Arctic, because we know that he's actively engaging in the Arctic, we need to make sure that we have a presence in the Arctic as well as enabling partner nations. Now, I believe in America first. I do believe in America first, but not America alone. We have partners that can engage in the Arctic. We are happy to be a supporter of that activity, but we need to enable other nations to help us push back against Russia. It shouldn't just be the United States.
Speaking of partners, Finland has indicated it wants to join NATO. Sweden presumably is going to do that next week. If they applied and the administration says yes and all the other countries said yes, big ifs, and it comes to the U.S. Senate, will you vote for Finnish and Swedish membership? Do you think the Senate will?
I think we have enough support in the Senate to support that effort. And we have seen active engagement. I had a number of the Swedes in my office just a couple weeks ago engaging in this discussion. And so the Finns and the Swedes they're terrified right now. What they see going on in Ukraine, because Russia can easily target those non-NATO members, because now they know We're not going to put sanctions on you until you invade a country. We aren't going to push back against you. We'll just allow you, Vladimir Putin, to enter into these nations. They are terrified. So if there are ways that we can enable them to become stronger together, I think that's the right strategy.
Great. Question from the floor.
Thank you very much. I have two brief questions, and one I think leads into the other one. And I think you may have touched on this just a moment ago. But if I understand the situation in Ukraine correctly, I believe we're providing all kinds of sophisticated defensive weapons. But at what point, assuming the Ukrainian army or military continues to be successful and they start pushing the Russians back to their own border, is there a red line there? They have to stop at the border, or can they continue and push into Russia? And will we then change over to providing offensive weapons so that the proxy war everybody talked about starts to happen? And it leads into the second question in the sense that I still vividly remember from my early childhood days in the early 50s, the nuclear war drills that we used to have in school. Climbing under our desk, that was going to do a lot of good, but that's what we did. If it gets to the point where it becomes an offensive war, Ukraine against Russia in certain areas, and if those two countries do join NATO, and now he's got NATO right on his border, and Putin starts to feel the heat, how serious in Washington are they talking about the possibility of a nuclear war?
So for the first question, certainly we're providing sophisticated weapons systems that the Ukrainians can use to regain control of their own sovereign territory. And that is key, is that they want to maintain their sovereign territory. So they will use those weapon systems to push Russia out. Beyond that, that is a discussion that our DOD, as well as President Biden, needs to have with President Zelensky. But their goal, their stated goal simply is to expel Russia out of Ukraine. Okay, they are not intent on trying to, they should not. They should not. We are talking about sovereign borders. So they should not then move towards Russia and go into Russia. That is not the objective here. And that's what we're enabling, just sovereign territory. Okay, so that is the first part of the question. But then you touch upon what is that big gorilla in the middle of the room that we don't like to address, and that's Vladimir Putin and the threat of a nuclear engagement. So Vladimir Putin has made insinuations about that he's threatened to escalate with nuclear detonation. Okay, so do we take that seriously? Absolutely, we should take that seriously. And we have to remember that part of the reason we are in this situation is because in 1994, we entered into the Budapest Agreement with Ukraine and Russia. And that agreement was that Ukraine would get rid of all of their nuclear weapons in exchange for the Americans to provide their defense. We're in a situation now where Ukraine has no nuclear weapons. They are an easy target. They have no nuclear weapons. They are not part of NATO. They are an easy target for Vladimir Putin and Russia. So how far does that go? This is the discussion that's had, at least in somewhat polite society out there, is what happens if there's a nuclear detonation by Vladimir Putin in Ukraine? Does that plume go into our allied nations, NATO territory? And then what is our reaction to that? Okay, so those are the discussions that are held behind closed doors. Though, what we do not want to do is publicly display to Vladimir Putin what our response would be, what Ukraine's response would be, and other allied partners. But let me tell you, if Vladimir Putin engages in nuclear war, he will be a pariah on the world stage, even worse than he is now. People see the images on TV every single day of innocent civilians that have been targeted by Russian soldiers and Vladimir Putin. And we see it as unacceptable. You go that step further with nuclear detonation, there would be others that would have no choice but to decry his actions in Ukraine. People like China, the Emiratis, others that would have to engage at that point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're almost at the end of our conversation, but I want you to give because that was a pretty bleak answer, and it's a bleak place to end. So
I'm so sorry.
No, I mean the bleakness is what's happening in the real world. So there are problems there. But you're a politician, you're a senator, you are from the Midwest, so you're an optimist by nature.
I am.
What gives you hope?
I am. Thank you. Let's end on a high note, because there is so much about the United States that gives me hope, Ivo. And it truly, the bright spot that we can hang our hats on today is that we are in the greatest nation on the face of the planet. And I am so in love with my country and the opportunities and freedoms that we provide to our citizens, just by virtue of birth or by your citizenship here in the United States. We have been given such a gift. And it is up to us to continue to promote our values and our objectives. And we cannot squander it, and we cannot become complacent. This is the nation that those that are oppressed run to. They run to the United States of America. They do not run to China. They do not run to Russia. They do not run to Iran. And they certainly aren't running into North Korea. So it is our opportunity to really recognize the importance of the United States and our engagements globally, because we have such a great country. We must defend it. We must promote it. We must enable it. And so that's why I'm so thankful I've been able to spend some time with you today, because of the work that you are doing right here at the Council and promoting our opportunities worldwide, and just to demonstrate to others that there is hope that exists in what could be a very bleak world.
Thanks so much. That's a great place to end. I want to thank you for coming to Chicago and having this conversation with us, with folks online, and the folks here in the conference center. For all of those joining us online, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a program of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We've been really pleased to have Senator Ernst here, and wish you all a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. God bless you. Thank you.